Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest in this series of NR Times roundtable discussions. And today we're focusing on the soon-to-be published ABI Strategy and the impact it will have on brain injury care. Now, we've got a fabulous group of panellists with us who bring with them an enormous amount of experience, knowledge and insight on the subject we're discussing today. So I'd like to ask each of the panellists just to say a few words about themselves, their organisations and their areas of particular interest. And then we'll widen out the discussion to cover a range of areas relevant to the ABI strategy and the future of brain injury care. So perhaps I could start with you, Deirdre.
My name is Deirdre Healy and I'm a partner at the firm of solicitors Irwin Mitchell. I've worked in acting for brain injury survivors for about 30 years. So I've seen it all kind of develop. I'm really excited about the strategy and the soon to be published report and recommendations because Irwin Mitchell are a strategic partner with UKBIF and Chloe Haywood, who's been right behind this. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today and hopefully to see this moving forward, because I think we're all anxious that we get some movement from the government, which I suspect will be quite a hot topic of discussion today.
Great, thanks very much, Deirdre. Natalie.
Good morning. I'm Natalie MacKenzie. So I'm the director of BIS Services. So we provide cognitive rehabilitation to individuals living with brain injury and neurological illness. So we provide high caliber cognitive rehab assistance. So predominantly we work within the private sector, but I'm also a trustee at Headway, South East London, North West Kent. So it's nice to see Headway here as well. So I see sort of both sides of the coin, as it were, in terms of what services are available and the difference between the private sector and statutory community work. I also now have an online platform called the Cognitive Rehab Coach, where I work with people internationally, raising awareness and education and one-to-one and group services for individuals that are sort of caught outside of the net, as it were, or can't access services and seek services elsewhere. So like Deirdre said, really waiting with bated breath, really, to see what comes out with strategy. And if I hope that it's going to be covering as much as we want it to, and it'll be a great discussion to have today about the opportunities it's going to bring. Certainly at BIS, and I'm very passionate that we are making sure that people have really high specialist training, and we've got really good caliber staff working with individuals, particularly because we're seeing them a lot earlier on in their recovery. So yeah, that's me.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Natalie. And last but not least, Luke.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Luke Griggs, and I'm the Chief Executive of Headway UK. That's the UK-wide charity that helps people to rebuild their lives, relearn lost skills, and regain a degree of independence after brain injury, however that may occur, whether it's through stroke, trauma, aneurysms, any kind of injury sustained to the brain that can have lasting and significant impacts, not just on their lives, but also their families as well. And that's also a key element of hopefully the discussions today, because, we talk about brain injury survivors, but we also talk about brain injury families. So that's another of the key aspects that I think that will come forward. But I've been working with Headway. It's been my absolute privilege to work with Headway for the past 16 years. And I've been chief executive for around 9 or 10 months now. And, really honoured to be able to take the charity into its next phase of development.
Thanks very much, Luke. And clearly, this strategy has been a long time in development since Chris Bryant pioneered it as a private members bill back in December 21. So one would assume the consultation has been exhaustive and it's very much been a collective exercise and an inclusive one. Has that been the case, Luke? Is that your experience?
I think the first thing I think is there should be the utmost praise given to Sir Chris. He's been a long-term champion of brain injury, and has had to really fight so hard to get us across the line. I think there's part of me that actually, when Boris Johnson, as then Prime Minister, announced that that he was going to get his government to actually engage with a strategy and develop a strategy, I think we were all elated, and it was real progress. But actually, that was on the back of Sir Chris's private members bill, which was on the verge of being passed. And actually, looking at what I see as a real lack of progress with this strategy and some real frustrations from our part, I actually think there's part of me suggests that actually if Chris Bryant's private members bill had passed, we would be in a much better position now, because there would have been a statutory requirement for the government to actually act. Instead, we've had a lot of protracted discussions. I mean, Headway's been involved with some excellent civil servants at the at DHSC over this period. There's a lot of good people in the background trying to do a lot of great things, but actually there's real questions about the barriers they seem to be facing, and the government's lack of enthusiasm for actually getting behind this. And I find it very, very frustrating. Yes, there's been consultations, but in the first few drafts of the strategy we've seen, certainly we put forward about 9 or 10 key areas that we wanted to see covered in the strategy, and not one of them has seemed to be made onto any of the first drafts. Similarly, I wrote to the then Minister Helen Whately back in January, never got a reply, asking for a meeting, never got a reply to my letter, let alone the meeting. We've now got a new co-chair in Will Quince MP, who, to his credit, replied to me very quickly. But Will Quince has since announced that he will be stepping down as an MP at the next election. And I think you put it all together, and there's a real sense of frustration to say that is the government truly committed to actually getting a strategy across the line, despite the very best efforts of so many families, individuals, carers, campaigners, charities, organisations. So Chris, the DHSC, all these people are trying so hard to put so much effort into making this happen, and yet there's real frustration about the progress.
Is that universally felt, Natalie? That sense that there now is some real urgency to see what this strategy says and whether or not it will offer progress and deal with some of the barriers that Luke talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is just, as you say, Luke, such a massive sense of frustration about why it has to be so long and drawn out and protracted with so many sort of consultations. And I guess certainly even in our own arena, and obviously we're within it all the time, there's still that sense of disappointment and frustration amongst everybody. And I guess for us, there's a lot of, well, what's happening to all these individuals and their families in the meantime? Why and what is the need going to be by the time this actually comes out? Is a real concern, especially for families. And as you say, there's so many people doing such great work. But why does it need to be taking this long? And it's so disappointing to hear, as you say, that those areas just aren't even in these drafts, and people working hard to try and get responses. And why aren't they there?
Deirdre?
I'm going to try and be slightly more positive, because I touched base with Chloe Haywood this morning because of joining the webinar today. And I agree entirely with Luke and Natalie. It has been chaotic, this government dealing with the strategy. And Chris Bryant advocates this extremely well, in terms of he had to go for a strategy because he wouldn't have got home on his private members bill. So, the government liked the strategy, and they did seem to adopt it, and Boris announced it. And then, as Luke very eloquently covered, we see a whole turnover of staff, don't we, taking responsibility for different areas in the government, because they get shuffled every second week, it appears. So, there hasn't been consistency there. And when they have produced something, it hasn't covered the heads that they need to. And it started and is really well summarised in the Time for Change report that UKBID put forward and Sir Chris took on and used as the basis in what areas do need to be covered. So it's written in black and white what the recommendations need to be. They don't really have to do such a lot of work, do they, Luke, in terms of identifying where the need is?
Well, I think take it back even further, Deirdre, in terms of for those of us who've been involved in the brain injury sector for quite some time, there was the National Service Framework for Long-Term Neurological Conditions going back, 10 10, 12 years. I can't remember the exact time. And we were all equally excited at that point. I mean, the framework has been set long before, before that in terms of what needs to happen. But the problem with the NSF was that, and again, it's the age-old problem, that it was words on a piece of paper with no commitment for funding. And this is the reality we're facing now. There has been consistent responses from the government to say that there will be no funding available for this strategy. That's the word that we've been hearing from the people we've been speaking to. And if you're trying to implement meaningful change, we know around this panel how many areas of concern there are within brain injury families and individuals and carers, and the inaccessibility to rehabilitation, both at the acute and community stage, and all the gaps that we see. The reality is that no meaningful change is going to happen in the sector of brain injury without significant funding. And that's a huge problem. So yes, the framework has been set long before the Time for Change report, way back to the NSF. And I even take you back to one of the key points that's been mentioned so far in draft strategies and some that we've made, which is the lack of statistics available about people living with brain injury. Now, this was back in 2001, the Health Select Committee reported on head injury. And one of the key recommendations in 2001 is that the government needs to urgently invest in some in-depth statistical analysis, which will be very, very complex with brain injury, to understand the prevalence. Because how can you set policy if you don't know how many people are affected by a specific condition? Now, this was over 20 years ago, this recommendation was made, and it's still something that's not happening and not being talked about as part of the draft strategies. So, the framework has been set for many, many years, and consistently brain injury seems to be ignored, pushed down the line. We see other long-term strategies that receive funding. And again, that unfortunately, it's horrible that we have to continue to say that it's all about the money. But the reality is, if you're going to make meaningful change in this area, it has to be funded.
Mm.
I mean, that's a really clear message, Luke, about how you mobilise any strategy and what the fundamentals will be. And as you say, it does come back to making sure that things are properly resourced. But just coming back to the strategy, and I'll start with you, Luke, what would you like to see it say? What should the manifesto be for a government committed to making a fundamental difference to those living with brain injuries?
Well, when it was first launched, there was an initial consultation went out that we were all required to go to no more than 10 pages. And I think all of us could have written 100 more about what we would like to see happen. We broke it down to some very basic fundamentals of what we see in terms of what would improve people's lives in general areas, such as improved access to specialist neurological rehabilitation from the moment brain injury strikes all the way through the care pathway to community-based brain injury. So it touches on enabling people to relearn how to walk and talk at the very acute stage of brain injury, through to how to live with brain injury and rebuild your life and play a meaningful part in your local community. And that rehabilitation shouldn't be time limited. It should be accessible to all, and it shouldn't be based on a postcode lottery. We also talked about investment and work in the criminal justice system, because we know that the brain injury is so overrepresented in the criminal justice system, often for wrong reasons. And there's an awful lot of work that certainly Headway and others are doing in that area, but it needs to be consistent and across the board, and working with the MOJ to do so. We talked about the need for continued review of the disability benefit system. That we see too many people with hidden disabilities and lack of insight and what have you with brain injury being penalised within our system, not getting help and support they need. We want focus on families and making sure carers and families get better, consistent, long-term support, because they too have their lives completely changed by brain injury. There's a lot of work going on in concussion or brain health in sport, which again needs to be expanded on. I mentioned before about the need for statistical analysis. At the moment, that's left to Headway to produce really the major data set on brain injury, and that's based on hospital admission statistics. And that's what we actually have to purchase. We have to pay charitable money to NHS England to actually get the raw data, to then spend our own time and resources producing those data. That can't be right. And then obviously we talked a little bit about prevention, because obviously, as a charity, we don't want to see people coming through our doors. Thank you very much. So they're the broad areas, and I've tried to be as succinct as I could with all those. But they're the broad areas we talked of in our initial consultation.
That's really helpful, Luke, and admirable that you managed to get 10 pages down to those very succinct points. Deirdre.
Just to add to your list, it's also in education, isn't it? And
Yes.
teachers being aware, because so many young kids have a hidden disability and they may have behavioural problems. They're just seen as a problem and teachers aren't aware. So I think the strategy has raised awareness, which we shouldn't lose sight of some of the positives, because it has got an all party group in Parliament sitting and talking about it. And I suspect several of them, if not most of them, weren't aware of brain injury and what it looks like, because you can't see it, can you, quite often? So I think education is a real key piece as well, isn't it?
And education for those working within the support services as well, better high caliber staff. We're not looking at having people that just deal with personal care, which has an element, but really high level information about brain injury, the impact on cognition and function, working, and the ability to work within that family unit, which is such a skill. The work that we do certainly in the community is incredibly intrusive in people's homes, and to have this rounded level of skill to be able to work within that family dynamic and within multidisciplinary teams who also need to have a better awareness of brain injury and its long-term impacts. And as you said, Deirdre, that hidden disability, especially with individuals who on the face of it have great face validity and are able to really function to a high level, but still can't return to work or maintain family relationships and parent to the level that they used to. Having understanding for professionals working in that across the board is such an important part.
I completely agree with both Deirdre when it comes to the education piece. I completely agree with that, and also, Natalie, you're right that with the professionals, and we touched on the professionals. I think that we also know there's a huge gap there in the number of neurological specialists there are, whether it's neuro OTs or whether it's neuropsychologists, neurophysios, it's speech and language therapists. Access to these specialists is very, very difficult, and it's a huge postcode lottery because there simply aren't enough of them to go around. And then when you're extending it further, you're talking about the education piece, and it's something that we are keen at Headway to continue to develop and push for, is that too many people working in associated jobs, whether it's social workers or whether it's benefits advisors, still don't know enough about the hidden disability. So there needs to be a huge education piece on there. But the other factor that we didn't touch on, this is something I'm sure that as a trustee that Natalie will be passionate about as well, is currently we've got a real crisis with the local provision of community-based rehabilitation and support, particularly for those local charities, those local headways in particular that receive local authority commissioning to provide these services that otherwise would not be delivered. And without the likes of the local headway charities, people would have nothing to turn to. And whether they attend the rehabilitation programs 5 days a week or just go to once a week because that's all the respite that their carers can get, it makes a huge difference. And yet what we're seeing at the moment is there are a number of headway charities, local headway charities, that are at imminent risk of closure because of a lack of funding. Now, I put that point to the various ministers, to Helen Whately, but also to Will Quince, and said that unless the government acts now, by the time this strategy is published, and a strategy that lauds the wonderful work of these headway charities across the UK and their communities, by the time they publish this strategy, many of those charities may no longer be there. The response I received to that was, we recognise it's difficult, but the move to ICSs and integrated care boards and integrated care systems, that's the best way around this because they get the local decision making. Well, local decision making is all well and good, but if you don't have anybody in an ICS that has specialist knowledge of brain injury, it's going to be difficult for them to actually commission brain injury. Similarly, if they don't have the funds to commission these services coming from central government, there's no money to distribute in the first place. And that's a huge worry that I'm sure Natalie will, and I know that Natalie will echo, because I know the challenges facing her Headway charity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Headway South East London, North West Kent are a great example, because we cover Bromley, Greenwich, Lewisham, Southwark, Gravesend and North Kent. And it is to deal with so many different local authorities, all who have differing levels of expertise. You know, one of them is particularly good, and we get quite a few quickly referred and funded clients, but then literally you can be 2 minutes down the road from another client who's not able to access the service, or is able to access it but at a much reduced level, has potentially a higher level of need, but simply down to who was that person agreeing to the funding not doing it. It's really sad to see. And as you say, Luke, we've got individuals who are facing losing the only support service that they have, and those family members losing that time of respite. And it's an absolute travesty, really. And it's people working so hard, and certainly I just don't understand what takes so long, if I'm honest. You know, we work closely with King's College. We have an early intervention coordinator there who is doing that part of the role. You know, they're there early, they're putting in the funding applications, and they're sat on for weeks on end at a time where that family has such a high level of need, because they don't understand what's happening to their loved one. Their loved one doesn't understand what's happening. And just that small level of input isn't being able to be provided. For no real apparent reason other than people not understanding and not having that funding, which just isn't good enough for that.
I think the pathways are absolutely essential for any of this to work, because it has been proved, and there has been research done, that particularly neuro-rehabilitation is the most cost-effective of all rehabilitation. So we talk about the individual, and Natalie, you mentioned whether somebody can resume some kind of work. You know, there's a whole array of different outcomes with the same injury, isn't there, often? But it doesn't just stay with the survivor of the injury. We've talked a lot about families and carer fatigue and respite that they need, which if it's not there, you're taking them out of the workplace, and we're missing out on that revenue stream as well. It is a no-brainer to invest heavily at the start for as long as needed, so that the outcome is as best it can be, primarily for the individual, but the add-ons that society gets from making that person the best they can be, it's huge, isn't it? But it's not a vote winner, because it takes time, and it's further down the line. So I can see why the politicians keep trying to kick it down the line, because, you know, that's not going to keep them in government, is it really?
I echo what everyone has said, that, you know, we've had years now of a very disjointed system, healthcare and social care particularly. But I think for us, and one of the things we see most commonly, is that the Department of Work and Pensions sitting so separately to those other two organisations means that the people that could maybe get back to work with some support, it's just not on the health or social care agenda at all. So it's completely left. People are supported to be able to eat and drink and get to the toilet, and maybe if they're lucky get out, but generally we see care is put in very early on rather than rehabilitation, which obviously has a massive long-term cost. And if people then aren't back to their work, or as you mentioned, Deirdre, that kind of carer responsibility, the carers can't get back to work either, because they're now occupied doing the support, which actually maybe wouldn't be necessary if the early rehab happened and it was consistent and it was high standard. You know, we know that rehabilitation makes a difference early on. I think you've just said that as well, that the cost effectiveness of such investment really goes a long way, and across the individual, their families, society as a whole, and it's not happened yet. So I guess we're sitting here waiting for that ABI strategy that actually brings it into focus. And it's interesting, isn't it? We work with a lot of people. About 50 to 60% of our workload is traumatic brain injuries. So we see this a lot, and we increasingly over the past kind of 10 years, but certainly the last 6 years, I would say we've noticed that dropping off of competence within the national statutory services. We're having to do more, I suppose, in the private sector, and we're lucky we do have a lot of neuro specialists, and so we can provide that. But in the past, we did a bit more working with, and now we're just finding these huge vacuums. So it can't come soon enough, really.
Can I just ask and invite any of the panellists to sort of provide their thoughts on this question? Is awareness a big issue? It strikes me that for something that affects, I think the number I saw was more than 1.3 million people in the UK. I suspect that's a conservative estimate. The level of public awareness and political awareness of what an enormous issue this is for so many people seems to be at the heart of this. And maybe if there was more awareness and people were more informed, then look, your point, there would be a rush to provide the funding to respond to some of the issues that we've covered today.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that 1.3 million figure, and there's one or two figures that are banded around, and the truth is, we don't know how many people are living with the effects of brain injury. We know how people are admitted to hospital, but that doesn't actually necessarily denote whether or not that they will actually live with the long-term effects. Equally, we know so many people are left without a diagnosis. I joined Headway, as I say, 16 years ago, and that, me learning about brain injury then, was able to identify that my own grandmother had been living with a traumatic brain injury all her life. Sadly, she died before I joined Headway. But you put the pieces together now, and she had a cycling accident when she was in her mid-20s. And we're talking obviously way back in the 1950s here. And of course, there wasn't that understanding. And she was a changed person. And she lived all that life with aphasia, with a lack of insight, with difficulties processing and retaining information. And her personality had changed, as had her physical abilities. And she didn't know why. She was always frustrated about, that thing you used to write with. And she gets so frustrated about not being able to find the word for pen. And her husband, my grandfather, was frustrated about why his wife different. So, we know there's so many people still today that slip into the net because they don't get that diagnosis, particularly if they had a mild to moderate brain injury that wasn't therefore picked up in the system. So we know that number is a problem. And I think if there was any kind of work done by the ONF or another party on this, that would help the situation. But talking to your point about awareness, I think we've come an awful long way in the past 10, 15 years in terms of brain injury being spoken about through the work of various different campaigners, not just Headway having the opportunity to speak in the national media, but all various partners and campaign organisations have all done their bit to raise awareness both publicly and in Parliament. And certainly Headway's got far more parliamentary champions now than it ever had. There's people across the House who are willing to talk about this issue in parliamentary debates. We know that the issue of brain health in sport has helped us to put that on the map, but now we need to actually try and change the direction of the media coverage about brain injury, not just thinking brain injury is about sport, about brain injury being a variety of different aspects and conditions and causes, and why we actually start using the momentum we've built to actually change the agenda and actually start talking about living with brain injury and what that actually means and the complexities of it and the fact that it can happen to anyone at any time. And I think that that's also the key message. None of us are immune to this, and yet people become experts in brain injury when it happens to either them or a family member. So I think that we have made tremendous progress. We're continuing to do so. And as going back to Deirdre's very positive, and she's quite right, we should be looking glass half full, not always half empty, as I'm prone to do, that we have got some momentum here. And we need to build on this and work collectively and collaboratively to actually continue to push for awareness on all spheres.
Yeah, I echo what you're saying there, Luke, in terms of it's become heavily a lot of awareness about sport. And it's interesting, we're a very sporting household, a rugby household, and we have lots of conversations with people that work nothing to do with brain injury. And it's interesting. And, even in parts of the country, my family from up north, still incredibly dismissive of the impact of mild brain injuries. It's that you often get when I used to be a lad, I hit my head loads of times, I'm perfectly fine. Or, they just need to get on with it type approach. And that there's, as you say, we've made huge inroads. I mean, certainly I've worked in brain injury for 20 years and people are much, much more aware. You have conversations with people on outside of the field and they are aware of it to a degree, but that real understanding and losing that dismissiveness of the long-term impacts of mild brain injury for me is really important. Certainly a lot of people that approach me as the cognitive rehab coach sit in the mild end of the spectrum. They have long-term symptoms, they can't work, they have significant vestibular issues, personality changes, but have simply been dismissed as malingerers is the word we often hear, and GPs dismissing them, saying that there's nothing wrong with them. They just have a series of symptoms and, it's not a brain injury, it can't be a brain injury, and not looking at things like the impact of multiple mild brain injuries. That sort of awareness is important as well. But yes, we have had a huge improvement in awareness, but I feel there's just still a long way to go.
We seem to be having a little bit of background noise. Can I maybe ask that we all just mute when we're not speaking and then unmute when we're going to speak? That might resolve it. Deirdre, can I come to you and maybe ask you to say a little bit about technology and the role of technology in making progress with reference to the things we're discussing?
It's really interesting because in preparing for today, I did write down assistive technology because, we're going down the route of AI. And I think I'm not a clinician, I'm just a lawyer, so I've got to be careful about what I say. But I work with lots of multidisciplinary teams. And of course, we were hit with COVID. Lots of my clients who relied on that MDT and support workers to keep them going. It was really hard for people with brain injury at that period. And we did move to some remote treatment, technological, but, with lots of people with brain injury, depending on where you are on a scale, they can't use technology. So they needed that face-to-face and hands-on input with specialist, highly trained carers. And I know Natalie's team, are the highest of caliber. And it's key that, isn't it? Because we've also got a crisis in care provision. So we don't pay our carers enough. We need extremely skilled people, and there's a paucity of them, isn't there? So every other treatment is looking down the road of AI, and I think it has a place for some, but maybe not for all. This is a particular class of, disability that requires very sophisticated management, doesn't it? And rehabilitation. But the earlier it gets in, the better the outcome will be with specialist rehabilitation, whether that be mainly hands-on or in part delivered remotely. I think both can exist depending on each individual, isn't it?
Yeah, thoughts on that, Penny?
Well, we're a hands-on functional rehabilitation model, so our whole model was interesting through COVID, and actually we took it upon ourselves, being a private company, but taking on the recommendations of the government at the time of the safe practice. We still, particularly with our brain injuries, we still went out because we saw people not coping, especially with the social isolation aspect as well, with their day-to-day. And yeah, I can only echo what everyone has said, that technology has a place. And actually it can be really useful for long-term strategies when you reach that plateau of functional restoration, when you stop making those gains and you're looking for how is this person going to live long-term with for want of a better word, with deficits that they have in their cognitive function at that time. And AI and technology can come in then, but I don't know that it can really progress. I mean, we tried remote, but it did not suit many, especially of our, I suppose, older brain injuries, but even some of our younger people that were technology savvy. If it was a new skill, it was very hard to learn. So yeah, it's interesting, and I do think that there's obviously opportunities to blend, and there's definitely a role for prompts and strategies that go long term. But I think ultimately, you know, a lot of our clients that have significant brain injuries, we will discharge from our therapy with, you know, more of a clinical kind of PA role to support work them in place to manage things like money and just keeping, you know, it's the people with that, the walking wounded. You can't tell when you meet them that they've got a brain injury. It becomes apparent if you meet people regularly that they haven't retained information and that there's some executive dysfunction. So yes, I think it's important to have these people and staff and a multidisciplinary team that is skilled and expert. And at the moment, the next problem that we've got is the next generation of those people, because they're not coming through, because the bursaries and grants that used to be available to do your degree are not existing. So, I mean, we're seeing that a lot of our workforce is starting to become a bit older, and we're not seeing the younger workforce coming through, and we're trying to do our bit, and we take students so that we might get the next generation. But I do tend to look ahead, and I'm already seeing that what happens when our current experts retire, there's this big gap underneath, and that's a concern. And that's even without talking about what Deirdre and Natalie alluded to with support workers being well paid and trained and valued in the workforce, which I don't see that there's a way to completely eliminate them. And I think that we would be foolish to go down that route.
Can I just come back to the kind of point about the need for people and technology and a bit of both and what have you? Because I completely agree with Penny. We've already talked about the fact that you know, there needs to be more neuro experts across the board, because when we, you know, Headway, we certainly recognise, I think if you take it back to the strategy, what we also, the key thing we wanted is there has to be a holistic strategy, because brain injury affects every aspect of a person's life. It isn't just a simple case of there's a problem, there's the fix, and every brain injury is unique. So we have people during lockdown, and you know, Natalie and many of all the Headway you know, local charities will have experienced this, that some of their service users were able to engage in the Zoom chats and the virtual therapies and you know, the virtual coffee mornings even. Many others weren't able to either access the technology, use the technology, or interact with it, or communicate with it. It doesn't suit everybody, and it can't suit everybody. And for many people, attending Headway isn't about relearning lost skills. It's about, for one afternoon a week, being around others who understand what they're going through, who can give them a sense of purpose and shared purpose, and give them that encouragement and respite and camaraderie and support. Those sorts of things are absolutely precious, not only for the individual survivor, but also for their families and carers. And we can't lose sight of that, which is why this strategy is a tricky one, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and it needs to focus on every aspect of a person's life. Now, that's why we were so excited about this being a pan-departmental strategy, but it's not turning out that way. It's turning into something a little bit different and talking about too many specifics about technicalities. We need to focus on the human lives here, and we need to focus on the fact that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's where technology, I'm sure, will play an increasing part in every aspect of all of our lives. But a lot of that about this is bringing people together and giving them that confidence to actually recognise that there can be life after brain injury, and they do not need to suffer in silence.
Natalie, that question about aspiration and particularly hope seems to sit at the heart of many of the things that we talked about, making sure that those people that live with brain injuries, diagnosed or otherwise, have hope that their lives can be made more full and better. That surely should be a golden thread that runs through this strategy, hope and ambition.
Absolutely. And I think it's getting that across in the early days as well, and talking back to the pathway, ensuring that, you know, the clients and their families are always surrounded by individuals, whether it be professionals or peer support and the likes of Headway, or to make sure that they know that that it's a slow process, and that you, after a period of time when you see, you know, the walking and the talking again and these big milestones, and then when individuals get home and all those nuances and the hidden deficits start to come out, and there's a time of turbulence, is having professionals and people around them to say, this is a really individual experience. I say to everyone, please don't go online. Don't talk about, you know, don't get, I mean, do go online for support, but don't get pulled into everyone saying what worked for me was this will work for you. You know, the internet is great, but it can also be an absolute plethora of bad advice and fear mongering as well, just as an aside. But making sure that people are there to say your life doesn't have to end here. You know, we talk with clients about, you know, you're not creating a new life, it's a new version based on this experience that you've had, you know, building that new sense of self alongside the awareness. And the thing with brain injury, as you all know, is it's that hidden disability with clients that also have such issues with insight and awareness. So being able to see how their brain injury impacts them and the difficulties that they can have accepting that. So you have family members who are able to see this big change, but the individual themselves living with it potentially can't. And that's difficult in terms of being able to engage in good rehab and have that motivation and understanding as to why the rehab's needed as well. So again, that level of expertise is so needed to say the amount of times that I hear non-compliant or unmotivated, and it's not about that, it's about that difficulty understanding the impact of the brain injury. But going back to what you said, Alistair, yeah, people need to be aware that there is a future with brain injury. Certainly, you know, we've got clients where we work a lot on that post-traumatic growth. There is actual positivity that can come out of it. Yes, your life has been dramatically altered and there are some things that you can't do, but there is opportunity to do other things. And that's so important. And if you don't have people around you, whether it's the groups to go to virtually or in person, just to see as well, see others that have gone on to do things that they wanted to do and haven't just got stuck in a life with brain injury of doing nothing. People need to see that in other individuals. And I think a certain celebrities or public figures who talk more about their brain injury, who do a lot of talks for Headway and do sort of documentaries, are really positive. But it's interesting when I have individuals say to me, for them, seeing those people can be really difficult because they're not there yet. They hear them talking about how they've come through the other side of their journey. But for them, it's difficult to see that that's ever possible. So yes, that hope is so, so important at all levels of the journey.
Thanks for that, Natalie. We've talked quite a lot about what we hope this ABI strategy will address. And as we close the discussion, I'd like to ask people about priorities. But before that, can we talk a little bit about what happens after the strategy is published? Because the strategy is one thing, mobilising it and mobilising it promptly is another. Can I ask panellists what their hope is once the strategy is published to ensure that the key actions contained within it, whether they're in isolation or actions maybe that are refined through further consultation, are mobilised and funded, and we actually see action coming from the strategy? Perhaps you'd like to start with that, Luke, because I'm guessing you've got probably quite strong views on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. If you're looking to me to be the voice of optimism, I think you're probably looking in the wrong place, because I think it's very difficult for us to look at how we are going to make sure these things are implemented and changed and it happens and it's accountable and what have you. Bottom line is, I think we just need to see that there's actually going to be a strategy that actually does come out. And once it does, we will, like everybody else, we will look at it, we will evaluate it, we will see that whether or not we feel it's something that we can actually support, because it needs to be meaningful if we're going to support it. And that's a real shame they're actually even having that kind of conversation. So I think it will really depend on what comes through the strategy. Certainly from our priorities at Headway UK, we're in the midst of developing a new long-term strategy ourselves that will not necessarily be influenced by the ABI strategy, but we are certainly putting all those resources in place to work with every government department that ever wants to work with us to actually try and assist this process, because there are so many good people who want to make a change within the civil service, and we will continue to work with them very closely with all departments, whether it's the DWP or the DHSC or the MOJ. We continue to do that, and we'll put those resources in place. But our other immediate priority is to try and support the Headway network of local charities to survive this funding crisis. That's where so much of our resources are going to right now, because they are struggling. So I think there's short term and there's long term, but I think we will all be looking to see what that strategy comes from, what it produces. I think the one commitment we can make is to say that this has got to be the start of the process. Whatever happens with this strategy, we've made such good progress and such momentum, and it has brought a load of different charities and campaigners together, and MPs from across the house as well. And that's momentum we cannot allow to drop off. So whatever happens with this strategy, we've got to reassure people this is the start of the process and not the end of it when it's published.
That's very positive, Luke. Deirdre?
Well, Luke's covered it in every direction, haven't you really, Luke? I think that the report, getting the strategy, I think they're really positive steps. I remain very cynical with Luke about where the funding comes from, because I don't see the government putting their hands in their pockets very quickly, but it gives us a platform, a solid platform to keep working at, I think. Education's massive for me. I hope there is something in the recommendations about education, because even in medical school, I think, and all the therapist training, there should be more than an hour about brain injury, because of the numbers that go in and out of hospitals, and GPs just don't get it. Mostly they don't get it. So that, I recently, we all have our own anecdotes, but I had a client, very limited insight, get a letter threatening to ban her from a GP because of the way she was speaking to the receptionist. Well, she's got a very serious brain injury. That's why the GP isn't aware of that in her treatment and accommodates that is unacceptable, isn't it, really? So funding, money, it's going to be money, and hopefully the recommendations made and the strategy enshrined, if it's suitable, and Luke makes a very good point there, if it's suitable and can be supported, it's about another stick to be the people who make the decisions on funding with, and we've all got to be engaged and continue passionately to achieve that, really.
Natalie, is that the way that you see it? This is another step along the road, and it's the start of, if you like, the next chapter for the subject we're discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly with Luke and Deirdre. I think it has to be this platform. And what's great is that, as you say, so many people are within the industry talking about it, and we have to have that hope that this doesn't just fall off the edge of the platform depending on what comes out. But I don't think it will. There's my optimism. I'm always a pessimist. But I think, going back to what Deirdre said, for me, it is education. And going back as well to what you were saying earlier, Penny, where are the people, even if there was a great magic pot of funding, the speed at which we can bring people in is really important. We're really passionate, and we're going back to, I speak in schools to bring awareness of brain injury and how it impacts lives. And we go into universities and try and lecture on the courses, like you say, Deirdre. It can't be that there's only an hour, even in some of the clinical psychology courses, actually talking about community neuro rehab can be incredibly limited. So that using that platform to go even further back, which in the list of priorities is probably further down. But I think long term, as you say, Penny, my fear has always been, certainly when I'm at that age, who on earth is going to be taking over? Who do we have coming in at this level? But my hope is that however the strategy comes out, is that the next generation will come into some level of funding and a higher level of awareness, and a better level of education, and the sort of baseline will be much higher. That's my hope.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm going to sort of start to move towards some final thoughts from each of the panelists in terms of the big priorities. But before I do that, can I just ask the panelists if there's any areas that we haven't covered that anybody would particularly like to speak about or address? Great. Well, I'm going to start with you, Penny, and ask you just to say a few words about what your hopes are for the strategy, what you think the big priorities are. And I guess if you were to pick one big thing that would send a message to decision makers and all those that have a stake in the future of improving brain injury care, what would that message be?
I think, I mean, there's so much to be done, to hold up something that I think might have the most impact today for the future, I think it is the awareness. I think that can often be the tipping point in it becoming, and I think a lot of work's been done, and people do know people or have experienced brain injuries themselves. So it's not completely coming from nowhere. And it's interesting because I look at the minute at there's a neurodiverse agenda that feels like it's sprung up quite quickly in the last few years. And I'm really aware of it. And I suppose it comes on the back of a mental health strategy. And it's funny, there's some pessimists here, but I'm eternally an optimist. And I always try to think about, okay, but what can we, what is possible? And I think that if there's one thing we can run with, I'm hoping the ABI strategy really works on that, a bit of investment in awareness and public awareness, because that forces the issue a bit more. And I think we've seen that with some of the other agendas that have floated up, and social media is these platforms have made talking about things a lot easier. As I think Natalie said earlier, sometimes people fall into a rabbit hole that's not quite useful to them, but on the whole, I think we've got some scope with that. So it's not always massive investment needed, but it is, again, the right people driving that with an agenda to do it. So that, and I think second priority, I'm struggling between the two of investment, but the diagnosis as well. I think there's so many people that we see that haven't been properly diagnosed, and the impact that has on their life down the line, with them not sustaining a job, not sustaining their relationships, some of them ending up in the judicial system because they cannot figure out the right from wrong, and they've fallen through every crack because nobody's caught them. The GP, the hospital, their family just are despairing, and they end up being very alone. And some of that, I know we're so lucky and privileged at Think Therapy First, because people usually come, to us with some insurance money, so their rehab is funded, and we see these people early, and we take people out of inpatient units where they're just not sure why they're in there, and we get them their lives back. So it's possible, and we've got data and outcomes. So if we can get diagnosis and get that awareness, they're the two things for me.
Great summary, Penny. Thank you for that. And in fairness to our panelists, I think we've got a panel full of optimists who are just pessimistic about certain things. Deirdre, if I could ask you the same question for your big priorities.
I'll be quite quick, actually, because my major hope is that we see the document, because it was imminent in July, and the most recent information is it should be published before Christmas. And there is obviously a caveat that it needs to cover the holistic side, as eloquently set out by Luke, because all of these things, they're so inextricably linked, aren't they? Awareness, education, diagnosis, and then you bring it round to need, what's provided, getting that person holistically treated. So, all the ingredients are there. It's not brain science. It is brains, but it's not scientific. It's kind of obvious, isn't it, to those of us who are working in this area? And then investment. I said I'd be quick. I wasn't quite as quick as I promised.
No, that was very concise, Deirdre, and powerful as well. Natalie.
I mean, I think I have to echo both, really. It has to be about investment. For me, I think, apart from the education awareness, I mean, all of it, we've got to sum up. But I think the big thing for me is the quicker access to appropriate services and the speed of which they are provided for me, because we see the difference in individuals who can get quick access versus those who can't. And it does, and it can lead to much more favourable long-term outcomes, and that's the whole point of it. So yes, I think that would be my main, and also just that the complexity, and not to say that to confuse it all, but that this won't be a one-size-fits-all for every individual. That's not the nature of brain injury, and I know that's not it's the same across any sort of diagnosis, but certainly in brain injury, that's so important. It really can't be a one-size-fits-all approach.
Thank you, Natalie. And Luke, you get the final word.
Well, I think the best way I could sum it up is to say that we know that with the right help at the right time, there can be life after brain injury. We also know there's so much passion, determination, expertise, specialism, commitment across the brain injury sector from so many different private organizations, charitable organizations, associated companies. There's so much passion and determination to support one another and to achieve this improvement of life after brain injury. And at the moment, it just does seem that is being held together by just goodwill alone. And we cannot allow this to deteriorate. We need to make sure that these local Headway charities are properly, adequately, sustainably funded, because without them, people are left with nothing. And we cannot allow that to happen. We've got such an opportunity here to fundamentally and in the long term change the setup, change the system, improve life after brain injury for so many more people. So, we will continue to do everything we can, all of us, I'm sure, and in this call and in the community, will continue to fight as hard as we can to make sure that this is the beginning of the journey and certainly not the end.
Thank you, Luke. And I think that's a really positive note on which to end a profoundly important discussion. We need a meaningful strategy, investment to back it up, and real follow through. I'd just like to thank each of our panellists for bringing the insight that they have to this discussion and their experience as well. I think that anybody listening to this will realise that there's an enormous amount of work going on to improve brain injury care, and it is a very positive view of the future, but we do need clarity about this strategy, and we need it urgently. I'd like to thank everybody that's watched the discussion today. Please share it as widely as possible. This discussion needs to be seen and heard and engaged with by as many people as possible, particularly those people that are in a position to influence some of the things that we talked about. So once again, on behalf of NR Times, can I just thank all of our panellists for participating today and sharing their insight with us.